On this week's Talking Politics, the major risk at the heart of Trump's tariffs gamble.
He is dicing with extreme danger.
The critical decision that looms for Keir Starmer.
The dilemma is he won't be able to have his EU cake and his US cake and eat it. He'll have to choose between which deal is more important.
Plus, the benefits and dangers of dining with politicians. When I went to lunch with her, she was not the person I expected.
My lunching moment of shame, there was an absolute rising star that I was told that I had to have lunch with, and I fell asleep during it.
Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Bradby, back from Malta for 2 weeks, where I was watching the filming of my TV drama, ITV drama, which was kind of magical experience. We'll talk lots more about that next year. Robert has very kindly dialed in from home. If you're watching this, you can see he is on holiday, no less. So, Robert, thank you very much indeed for breaking your holiday to come and talk all things politics here and abroad.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. And I mean, it doesn't feel like a holiday because obviously I've been vacationing or, trying to vacation inside Donald Trump's chaotic brain, trying to make sense of what he thinks he's doing. So definitely not as pleasurable as a couple of weeks in Malta.
I mean, I don't know how you do, but I find it very hard to switch off from the news at the moment. I mean, maybe it always has been, but I feel like particularly, partly because it's so hard to read. And I guess that's what we can do in discussions like this, is try and help people read it, because I think we're both finding it really hard. So maybe we can jump in. You say trying to work out what Donald Trump is doing. I think we probably both agree we're not sure that Donald Trump knows what he's trying to do, that he seems to change the parameters of what he's even attempting to achieve on a constant basis. But let me start with a very basic question. Do you think it is now inevitable that the US economy will enter a recession? And then we'll talk about the rest of the world and us. But let's just deal with the US first.
Yeah, I think it's very likely. Surveys of consumer and business confidence have plummeted. Very difficult to make investments at the moment just because you don't know what the tariff regime is going to be like. You don't know what the tax regime effectively will be. Cancerous uncertainty, so investment will fall, consumer spending is, all the signs show, falling. So yeah, very, very likely we'll be in recession, but probably not a deep recession, simply because consumers have savings, businesses' balance sheets are better than they were, for example, back in 2007-8. Even so, one should not understate the incredible shock that Trump personally has forced on the American and global economy, because only a few weeks ago, all the credible forecasts were saying America was going to grow 2.5% or so this year. He inherited a pretty buoyant economy. Now looks likely that growth this year will be naught or a bit less than naught, maybe -1. So, a swing of 3.5 percentage points is incredible damage for any single individual to achieve. We should not underestimate, we should not understate the damage that he's done, even if the recession turns out to be shallow.
I was looking at a lot of polling ratings this morning as I came in. And as you would expect, his standing amongst independents, in particular in America, those who voted for him in the last election, is absolutely cratering at an incredible rate. His economic approval rating, even amongst some Republicans, but particularly amongst independents, is falling precipitously, as is his overall approval rating. You would think that might tempt him to pull back, change his mind, and all the rest of it. But he's got himself in a real hole here where it's very difficult to get out of this saving face unless he does he probably needs to do a complete reversal economically. But in face-saving terms, that's a very, very difficult thing to achieve. One thing I wanted to ask you, though, that's been on my mind is that obviously nobody who was, alive and around in 2007-8 will forget your coverage of that crisis, breaking the story of Northern Rock and all the rest of it. But I remember you saying kind of at the time and since that it was relatively easy to read. Not that it was an easy situation; it was a very complex situation. But that you were able to see the fundamentals. This massive, over leveraging and all the rest of it, and you were able to see the potential net consequences. And that I think a week or two ago, you were saying you were finding this crisis very difficult to read because it's effectively one man trashing the world economy, and it's very hard to see what the impact of that will and won't be. Do you feel a week or two on that you're finding it easier to read now, or are you still thinking, well, this is impossible to effectively run the numbers and make predictions?
No, I'm more confident now about both my understanding of what he thinks he's achieving and then what the outcome will likely be. It is still more complicated than 2007, 8 because everything hinges on what he decides to do. Um, and he is capricious, unpredictable, changes his mind. Uh, and so day to day, it is still very unnerving and very unsettling. It's why business confidence, as I said earlier, and investor confidence has plummeted because of the lack of certainty, but around some big trends. So tariffs, we don't know what the average level of tariffs will settle at because there are a whole bunch of investigations that he's ordered. We're not going to get the results of those analyses, government analyses, for probably a few months. So, there's uncertainty around what's going to happen there. But, basically we got an average tariff level at the moment imposed by Trump and America of about 25%. That is, the highest level of tariffs the world has seen since the Great Depression. That is, that may fall as he goes through these country to country negotiations, but tariffs are going to be with us, and we should be under no illusion. This is part of why what I am now more confident in forecasting. The problem with protectionism is when you protect businesses from competition, historically all the evidence shows they become less efficient, they become less productive. So over something like a 20-year period, living standards in America will undoubtedly be lower than they would otherwise have been if he hadn't mucked around with the status quo. And then finally, and this is the big thing that I've obviously been focusing on a lot over the last few days, about the extraordinary damage that Trump has done to America's financial standing in the world. Typically what happens in a period, of global financial turmoil is investors go to what they regard as the safest assets in the world. And, for decades, the safest assets in the world have been the US dollar and the debt of the US government. And so typically, America benefits in a time of financial turmoil because the dollar gets stronger and the price of US government debt rises. When the price of US government debt rises, the interest rate that the American government pays falls. Now, the miraculous and, most people would say disastrous thing that Trump has achieved with the implementation of his turbulent plans is that investors have not bought the dollar. They've sold the dollar. They have not bought US assets. They have sold American government debt. And as a result of that, the interest rate that Trump pays, that America pays, has actually risen. And if that is sustained, that is throwing away perhaps the greatest economic advantage that America has had since the Second World War, which is in effect as the world's reserve currency. When the going gets tough, people put their money in America, which broadly means that American governments can do what they bloomin' like in terms of spending and investing. And if that has now been fundamentally undermined, that is another reason why America will be poorer. And worse than that, if the budget deficit forecasts that are being made on the basis of the tax cuts that he wants to make, and which, the Senate, for example, has already laid out, okay, that would lead to an explosion of the deficit. And against a backdrop where basically global investors are losing confidence in the safety of American assets, the interest rate on American debt could rise to levels that would cause a fully fledged fiscal crisis in America. America would struggle to borrow. And were that to happen, and just to be clear, I'm not forecasting that's going to happen soon, but it is a risk that one has to take seriously. Were that to happen, that would make the financial crisis of 2007-8 look like a vicarage tea party. It would be the mother of all global financial shocks. So he is dicing with extreme danger.
You've always said that if America enters recession, we will too. And I completely understand why you would say that. But is there a world in which America so trashes its own stability and credibility that investors kind of flee to Europe and to Britain as a safe haven and then we benefit? Or is that just, in your view, complete wishful thinking?
No, it's already happening. I mean, when investors sell the dollar, they have to buy something. So the euro has risen, Swiss franc has risen, Japanese yen has risen. There is on the margin some evidence of purchase of UK assets, but it's early days. I mean, just very briefly before I get on to the tremendous opportunities that are offered to the UK and Europe from this crisis. And I'm actually, in many ways, incredibly upbeat and very optimistic about how Trump has created the conditions for a massive revival of the UK and Europe. But there are two things to say. That will take a few years. And if America goes into recession, if there's a global recession, we will be hurt, right? No, you can't decouple from the world's biggest economy, particularly when it's in a trade war with the world's second biggest economy. Between the two of them, they account for well over half of the planet's GDP. In a trade war where both are damaged, the fallout is extreme for us. So, we should be under no illusion that for the next year at least, our economic prospects will be much worse. But I like to think further ahead, right? Let's now get back to what I regard as the genuinely exciting possibilities for the UK and Europe. Investors are looking at America and they see what I think phrase as gangsterish irrationality. It's not very appealing, right? You can't invest in a rational way if there's so much unpredictability. They look at Europe and what they see is basically stability, commitment to democratic values, commitment to the rule of law. That's all very attractive. Now, Europe's problems are also very conspicuous to see. Low growth, stagnating living standards, which has been a problem for since the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. But this is just a shock that the UK and Europe needs to revisit all that welter of regulations that make it harder for businesses to invest in growth areas. And at the heart of it, and this is something that he has also forced on us, and we should be probably grateful for this, is already, the outlines of quite an important industrial policy, because he's said to Europe, you have to take responsibility for your defense. So all these, all defense budgets in Europe are being increased. A ton of money is going into European defense companies. Quite a lot of that is high-tech investment. And that is a basis here, particularly in Germany, for an economic expansion program that will also boost productivity. So, I am genuinely, let's be clear, it is possible that European governments, including our own, will seize defeat from the jaws of victory. But broadly, Trump has set them a really important challenge, which is now you've got to do it for yourself. And that means really boldly creating the conditions that would allow an economic revival.
Okay, I want to ask you about the US UK trade deal in a second, but since you mentioned Europe, can I just ask you one other thing about it that's been on my mind? I mean, like, we talk about this all the time, don't we? But I think it's just worth checking in with you frequently. Where do you think Starmer's thinking is on closer integration economically or otherwise with Europe? Is he moving more in that direction? Is he standing still? Where do you think we are on that graph?
Look, they know that in order to ride this storm out, they have to do better trade deals with all allies. The more immediate issue is the one that you've already flagged, which is US trade deal. And I'm going to phrase this precisely at how I think it fits versus better EU trade deal. And the reason I say it's a versus is I don't believe we can have both. Because even though you've heard from JD Vance that, in that unheard interview saying he thinks the talks are going well and there's a pretty good chance of the UK getting a trade deal.
Said something nice about European country. I nearly fell off my chair.
Did. Yeah, he did. He did. But anyway, he's saying chances are we'll get a trade deal. Probably much more important to the UK and UK businesses, given that this is an enormous market on our doorstep, would be better trading terms with the EU. The thing that will potentially blow up having both is Trump, like all American presidents, wants better access for US farm products to the UK. The EU has veterinary standards that are inconsistent with more imports from America. And, there is a genuine risk that we will simultaneously agree deals with both, but these deals will be incompatible, maybe for reasons of food safety and food hygiene, maybe other reasons. But I think that the dilemma that Keir Starmer may well face is he won't be able to have his EU cake and his US cake and eat it. He'll have to choose between which deal is more important. And I think if he were to ask British businesses which is more important, they would unquestionably, a majority of them would say better, easier terms of trade with the Eurozone and the European single market, right? But we'll wait and see. But it's a big choice. Governments don't like making these choices, but I think they will have to make this choice.
Can we just talk about China for a second? I was Asia correspondent for this network for 3 years, between 98 and 2001. And one of the first things I covered there was Tony Blair's first visit after the 97 election to China. And I remember...
Yeah, I was there. Actually, I was on that trip.
Okay, I've forgotten that. But, you remember him standing in Beijing and saying, amongst other things, that he thought China was making progress towards greater respect for human rights and possibly some kind of, beginnings of a democratic process. And there was this whole, I don't know if you remember, there was this whole sort of argument that if you looked at the local level in China, there was kind of, putative democracy being developed and all the rest of it. And I remember at the time thinking that was absolutely horse. But every other political leader, obviously saw other political leaders come into Beijing during my time there. But then as political editor, I went with, Gordon Brown, and I went with David Cameron, and you heard the same things over and over again. China is moving in the right direction. We need to have a closer trading relationship. And I guess all I would say is, we're very focused on America at the moment, and America is not, is upsetting all of its allies. It's being rude to all its allies, is screwing up the world economy. Donald Trump seems to be doing one thing one minute, one thing the next. As we've talked about before, there is questions about the rule of law. There are questions about, he keeps threatening to take away the licenses of broadcast organizations he doesn't like. He's threatened to send American citizens who are convicted of a crime to the developing world countries in prison like El Salvador and all the rest of it. And we're very focused on, quite understandably so, on what is happening to our oldest, best ally. But we shouldn't forget that China is still fully an autocratic country with incredibly poor record on human rights, long history of repression, and on and on and on. Which leads me to, I guess, to my point, which is that I still feel there's a bit of a schizophrenia in our government, as there has been for the last 25 years, about what to do about China. George Osborne went out there and said, we must form a closer trading relationship. And here we are, not able to rely on America in the same way anymore, possibly wanting a closer trading relationship with China. China is a stable partner, it would seem, in terms of trade, but it is arguably a direct threat to us in a way that America probably isn't. And I just wondered if you had a view about what we should be doing about China and what you think the administration's attitude to China actually is when you peel back the curtain.
I'm not 100% sure what you mean by America not being a direct threat. America has already done a lot of damage to our living standards.
No,
right? That is a direct threat. Okay,
but it's not
now,
yet an authoritarian regime. I suppose is what I mean.
One should not be naive about China's appalling human rights record. All right, the plight of the Uyghurs is, just one of the world's scandals. Slave labor, a scandal, and the way that Western governments have sort of turned a blind eye to oppression of large numbers of people in China is shocking. One should not, in any sense, characterize China as some kind of great friend. But we should also recognize that the history of China going back centuries, but also, what we've seen recently is all about improving the living standards of Chinese people. And actually, the kind of, it is more confident, it has become more confident over the last 15 years than we ever thought it would be in terms of, investing in developing countries, trying to do deals with those countries but they are all focused on getting Chinese access, A, to, in many cases, vital minerals and energy resources, and B, opportunities for Chinese builders and developers to make money overseas. This is all very commercial. In those circumstances where, broadly, for 30, 40 years now, China has had a make China great again policy, right? It's been broadly practicing, in economic and geopolitical terms, what Trump says he wants from America. You could argue that all that Trump is doing, in his own way, replicating what China has done since Deng Xiaoping. I was quite interested that the government massively stepped up the anti-Chinese rhetoric when rescuing those ancient blast furnaces in Scunthorpe. And, they broadly set up the Chinese owner, Xingyi, as some arm of Beijing and an opponent of the British state. And I think that kind of rhetoric is dangerous. It is conceivable that Xingyi was directed by Beijing. It is conceivable, as Nigel Farage has alleged, that it only ever took control of these furnaces because it knew that there would be an opportunity to close them down one day, which would then allow it to basically ship a load of steel from China to the UK. And you could see that within the context of, some Chinese economic war against the UK. Or you could just say it's a big company, Xingyi, and it is rational, given that it's got lower cost production in China, to basically shut down the high cost production in the UK and then, ship in its cheaper steel. Now, the British government may not want that to happen, but I think to characterize that looks to me, it's appalling for the workers in Scunthorpe that they wanted to do that. But, that's business, right? British businesses over the years have closed down overseas factories because they didn't, they weren't commercial. So, yes, you could say, yippee, that the government has rescued these furnaces. But then to turn that into some sort of xenophobic attack on, China is, I think, dangerous.
We should talk about Liz Truss. Yes, this week she came up with the rather startling announcement that she was going to launch a free speech social media platform this summer, inspired no less by Donald Trump's Truth Social. It's yet to be named, but Truss Social seems the obvious choice, does it not? I just wanted to tell a quick story about. I don't know Liz Truss very well, but I think after I stopped being political editor and just after I started News at 10, I was asked to do this charity event called Turn the Tables. One of the people involved in it is the BBC correspondent James Landon. I don't know if you've done it, but the idea is, for those who've never heard of it, which will be most of our audience, is that basically it's a chance for a leading politician to interview a journalist. That's why it's called Turn the Tables. And I was asked to do it, and I was due to do it with Amber Rudd. And then at the last minute, I think she was Home Secretary at the time, she dropped out. And so on the day I turned up, and it was Liz Truss, who was then, I think, the Justice Secretary, who was interviewing me instead. And I didn't really know Liz Truss. And she did this interview with me, which was very, very funny. I mean, taking the piss out of me constantly for about 20 minutes. Not that hard, you might argue, but it was funny. And I thought to myself this week, what happened to that Liz Truss? Where's she gone? She seems to have gone further and further down this very sort of, I don't know, what would you call it? Narrow alley, really, is that since she was Prime Minister, and you've talked before about how you thought that in some aspects about the establishment, in inverted commas, I don't think you quite use those words, she did have a little bit of a point, and you've made that, and I think it's very interesting that you've made that point over the years. All that said, she does seem to be going further and further off to one particular side, and I found myself thinking this week, what happened to the Liz Truss that was doing that interview with me 10 years ago? I mean, what do you make of it?
Look, she's always been a bit reckless. I mean, when she was Justice Secretary, as you probably remember, she alienated most of the judiciary, and it's sort of amazing that her career survived what was a pretty big setback then. I mean, look, she's great company. I'm not surprised that I've done Turn the Tables. I'm not surprised that it was quite fun. And she can be lively and amusing. And she's not thick. She just is reckless, and she too often thinks she knows best. And although I think, and I've said this repeatedly, I think the Bank of England did let her and Kwasi Kwarteng down in the run-up to their notorious mini budget. Nonetheless, their judgments were in the mini budget, the unfunded tax cuts, were appalling against a backdrop of growing investor concern about rising inflation and rising interest rates, falling government debt prices. So they made some spectacularly poor judgments, and partly because of the incompetence of the Bank of England, but mainly because of her mini budget, the government came close to not being able to borrow. I've talked about that in the context, the much more scary context of America. But her term in office was a disaster. Therefore, the thing that sort of is, I suppose, quite striking about her desire, her determination to follow Donald Trump's lead in creating what she says is a social media platform where there'll be no censorship and people can really talk freely, is if you look at the market value of Truth Social, which I think is still a few $billions, almost its entire market value rests on the fact that people want to know what the next extraordinary decision that Donald Trump is likely to make. They want to know that. And he has an exclusive agreement with Truth Social that all his pronouncements will only go out on Truth Social. So people have to look at Truth Social to know, what the latest shock to the global economy is going to be, or the next extraordinary development, in these Ukraine peace negotiations is going to be, or what's going to happen in the Middle East. You have to read Truth Social to know what's going to happen to the world. I don't think you have to read Liz Truss's, whatever this thing is called, feed, to sort of learn about what's going to happen. I mean, even within our own home. I mean, let alone the world. So it seems to me this is an ambitious project, shall we say?
Okay, let's leave on this business. I don't know how many politicians we've been to lunch with over the years. How much of our various companies' money we've spent entertaining politicians for lunch or dinner or breakfast or whatever it may be. Given that I've been here 35 years, I think that would be a scary amount. Let's hope they got value out of it, eh? Who is the most surprising? We said Liz Truss was good company. Who else would you pick out as surprising, as in the person you found at lunch was not the person you expected to find? I mean, I can think of a couple examples. Suella Braverman. I know what she's really like, to her friends and at home. But when I went to lunch with her, she was not the person I expected. I mean, I think the first time I went to lunch with George Osborne, not what I expected. Probably the same is true of Neil Kinnock. I've said, I got on incredibly well with Neil Kinnock in previous time. But who else would you pick out where what you found at lunch or upon social engagement wasn't necessarily what you expected?
I mean, yeah, you're certainly right, George, Suella, Neil Kinnock. They are all very good company, worth talking to. And Truss is definitely worth talking to, even if one ends up disagreeing with almost everything she says. I'm going to turn it the other way, actually. I'm going to tell a really terrible story. My lunching moment of shame was I had lunch. Oh God, I'm trying to think how long ago it would be now. It's a long time ago. I was political editor, I think, at the FT. So we're talking, God, more than 25 years ago, right? And there was an absolute rising star that I was told that I had to have lunch with, a Tory, a very prominent, very famous Tory, who I went for lunch with. It was, by a margin, this is just the two of us, the most boring lunch I have ever attended, and I fell asleep during it.
That's not how I expected that story to end. That's an awful story.
Peston's moment of lunching shame. I will because this is a perfectly nice person. I'm not going to name them, but my God,
I had terrible, not one but two terrible lunches with a very senior Tory politician who we won't name. I'll leave it with one other thing. If you're wondering, listening to this, well, why do you spend so much of your time at lunch? It's difficult to overstate how much you learn at lunch. Very early on in my career, I was got to be quite friendly with a very senior person in the security services in Northern Ireland. Belfast was my patch. I was Ireland correspondent of ITN. I'd only been a trainee 3 years before, so I was still relatively green. And suddenly it became, one of the biggest stories in the world. Were the IRA going to have a long ceasefire or not? And I went to lunch with this senior security service person, and he said to me over lunch, yes, the security, they thought he believed the IRA were going to declare a ceasefire that Wednesday. The next Wednesday, it was a Friday. And I went back to the office, and we to be fair, we've been told from London, be careful of the IRA using the media, by spinning out the idea they're interested in peace. So I managed to talk myself out of running the story that night, and it ended up in the Observer over the weekend, but I've regretted it from that day to this. The story I should have run is this person was senior enough for me to run the story, security forces expect ceasefire this Wednesday, which at the time would have been a massive story. So I've kind of learnt that however big the thing you've been told over lunch is, the truth is someone told you that for a reason. And, if you trust them and you don't think they're using you, you just got to go with it. That was a very, very early lesson on what you learn at lunch. Another thing about lunches is, I don't know if you've ever found this, if you're in a noisy restaurant, it's a nightmare sometimes if someone's telling you something really sensitive and you're straining practically halfway across the table because you can't hear. I don't know.
Yeah, you're right. The logistical challenges when somebody's telling you something they really shouldn't be telling you in a crowded place can be very, very frustrating. I do slightly regret not only are our politicians in some senses less impressive than the ones that you and I grew up with, they're also way more repressed. I mean, when I first started in political journalism, basically, there were a number of sort of ministers who they loved drinking, and normally this was over dinner rather than lunch. But you just knew if you bought them a decent couple bottles of wine, by the end of the evening, you know, you'd be given the keys to the safe. But that doesn't sort of happen anymore. Everybody's a bit more restrained, and in those days, actually, I think quite a lot of politicians from both parties just hated keeping secrets. They wanted stuff out there. Some of it, I mean, obviously this was, I also started at the sort of birth of the professional spin doctor, Peter Mandelson, Alistair Campbell, much more control over the message. But equally back then, there were just a very large number of quite fun politicians who just wanted to spill the beans. And there are fewer of those today, which makes our job not quite as fun as it used to be.
All too true. I think we're a bit more sober as well. I remember going to dinner a few times as political editor and then running along to do a live for News at 10 and thinking, blimey, that third glass of wine might have been a mistake.
Listen, that was always less of a problem in print journalism. I mean, in fact, the extraordinary thing when I started in print journalism, this is probably a decent place to wrap, was, I mean, look, print journalism when I started was absolutely populated by high-functioning alcoholics. And the number of print journalists who just drank terrifying, amounts at lunchtime, and yet still managed to crank out copy in the after. I mean, it's just a different world.
Sure is. That's a great place to end. That's it for now. Robert and I will be back on Friday with our Q&A special. So see you then. Thank you very much. Goodbye.